Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week it's been some time, but we're going to get back into Joe Madureira's very short-lived, but also very long-lived Battle Chasers with Battle Chasers number 2. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in May of 1998, we get here on the cover a look at the entire team with Calibretto, Nolan, Garrison, Gully, and all the way up here in the top corner in the image logo, we get Monica. Overall, this is a pretty decent cover. I am surprised that Monica is just like all the way up here in the corner and not part of the main cover, but at the same time, most of what you see of her is just her chest, so I have a feeling that, Joe Madureira was definitely making a sales pitch, even if it is just a very small image of her up in the top. Joe Madureira, creator, story, pencils. Munir Sharif, I believe is how you pronounce that, story. Tom McWeeny, inks. Liquid. Christian Lichner and Aaron Lusson, colors. Richard Starkings and Comcraft's Dave Lamphere, letters. Comcraft's John Marisagan, maybe? I apologize if I'm wrong. Design. Scott Dunbier, editor-in-chief. Jim Lee, publisher. We start with a few knights riding across a forested landscape near the early sunrise hours, as one of them is telling the other that he believes that they're on a fool's errand. The man he's speaking to, by the name of Clavius, tells him that he knows that this is against the rules, but that they can be back with the rest of their group before anyone notices they're gone if they hurry. As they continue to ride through, his companion continues to question whether or not this is even going to work, and Clavius tells him that he's not certain, that this is an old friend of his that he definitely believes could be of help to them, but he has to convince him to join their cause, and that's no easy feat. As they approach a not finished home, the two of them slow down, and Clavius tells his companion to wait here as he's going to approach the house by himself, as his friend does not like visitors and he definitely doesn't like strangers, and that this is going to go a lot easier if Clavius approaches on his own. Clavius calls out as he approaches the building, trying to see if anyone's home, and is greeted by Garrison, who is in fact the owner of this rundown house. He immediately starts to mock Clavius a bit and asks why he's here, as he states, "I'm taking great care of myself, can't you see?" Of course, we notice that he already has a bottle of alcohol in his hand, and it is in fact something like 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. This, of course, is to illustrate the severe drinking problem that Garrison has, and that he's kind of let his life just completely fall apart. At this point, Clavius interrupts and starts to tell him of the attack on Aramis's house. This grabs Garrison's attention immediately, as he and Aramis were very close. Clavius tells him that a contingency of the royal guard was there and were all killed, and that also a female civilian died as well. Garrison asks if there are any leads, and Clavius states no, and what's worse is that they can't find Aramis's daughter, and they're worried that she has been kidnapped. This puts Garrison into a bit of a rage, as we see him grip the bottle so tightly that he actually shatters it in his hands. He turns away, and Clavius tells him, you're not powerless in this. You can come and help us. We're not asking you to rejoin the group. We just want your help in bringing these perpetrators to justice. We can see that Garrison is rather enraged and for a moment seems to be considering joining Clavius in his quest. However, when he sees the sword on Clavius's side, he pauses for a moment and then turns to walk back into his house. He tells Clavius to leave and never come back. Clavius tries to protest, but he's interrupted by Jaren, his companion, who begins to mock Garrison, stating, we don't need help from this drunk. What a dump that he lives in. And Clavius tries to silence Jaren immediately by telling him that the home was supposed to be a gift for Garrison's wife on their wedding day. We then see Garrison slowly walk back into his home as the conversation between Clavius and Jaren continues. Jaren tells him that The reason this place looks so bad and that there's no trace of any woman living here is because that Garrison's betrothed was killed on their wedding day, and after she died, Garrison saw no reason to finish the home. As we see Garrison walk further back in, he approaches a painting covered by a sheet that he pulls away. This, of course, is a painting of himself and Aramis together. And we can see that Aramis was a gigantic man, dwarfing Garrison by comparison. And it's kind of crazy to think how big he must be, given that Garrison is an adult man and also super jacked. And he looks like a child almost next to Aramis. At this point, Jaren asked, who exactly was this guy? You said he's a soldier. And at this point, Clavius tells him that this was Garrison, the greatest swordsman who ever lived. Jaren is shocked to find this out and even states, I thought he was dead. And Clavius says, well, in many ways, he is, as we see Garrison collapse down and kind of lose himself in his emotions as he struggles with what he should do. We then get an advertisement for Jean Co. Apparel Company. If you're not that old, you probably don't remember the fact that Jean Co. used to make the super giant, absurd, baggy pants that are kind of making a comeback today in 2025. They also made t-shirts and shoes and hoodies and whatnot. I'm just learning now that they also produced comic books. I have never seen one of these ever out in the wild, but if I do, I'm absolutely buying it. As someone who went to high school in the 90s, the late 90s specifically, I had a plethora of Jean Co. pants, and I unashamedly wore them on a near daily basis, not giving any care to the fact that I was walking around in jeans that were 32 inches around at the ankle and cost me $70, despite the fact that they were all going to start falling apart in less than a year because they were made out of the cheapest denim on earth. But, that was the style at the time, and I was well on my way to trying to keep that concept going for as long as I could, not getting rid of my last pair of Jean Co's until well into the 2000s, far after they had gone out of style. We then get another advertisement, this time for Batman the Animated Series, which in 1998 was just starting to be aired on Cartoon Network on a nightly basis. Of course, if you've ever watched this animated series, you know that it is kind of like the gold standard for superhero animated series in America. It really still holds up even to this day, 30 years later. It's a fantastic series. And if you've never watched it, what are you waiting for? Do yourself a favor. Find a way to watch this series and start playing it immediately after you finish watching this video, of course. Back to the story. We're then teleported to Nolan's home in the morning hours as he's getting ready to go on some errands. He asks Calibretto if he needs anything, and Calibretto states that he just needs some bird seed for all of his little friends here. This makes Nolan chuckle, and then he asks if Gully is still asleep. Calibretto responds stating peacefully, and Nolan states that's a good thing, that he wants her to get her rest after the night she's had. This, of course, is the morning after Gully's home was attacked, her nanny was killed, and also she was then hunted through the forest by a pack of werewolves, only saved when Calibretto interfered and defeated them, sending them all packing, killing most of them, in fact. He then tells Calibretto that no matter what, if she does wake up, do not let her put on the gloves, as they're an incredibly dangerous weapon, and he doesn't want her harming herself or others if she were to misuse them, and that if he had known that that was what was in the box she carried, he would have never opened it in the first place. He then waves his hand and creates a cloud for him to ride into town on, and Calibretto states that he'll make sure to keep an eye out for Gully and make sure that she doesn't get herself into trouble. At this point, Nolan states, yeah, that's the best idea, and remember, no matter what, if she wakes up, do not let her get her hands on the gloves. We're not going to deal with this. We're going to let the king deal with this, because if this is tied in any way to Aramis's disappearance, he needs to know. And Calibretto agrees as Nolan rides off. Calibretto then goes inside of the house and checks on Gully, seeing that she is sleeping soundly and that the box is safe. However, he's interrupted when there's then a knock at the door. Believing that Nolan has forgotten something, he goes back and opens the door, only to be confronted by the barrel of a large cannon. There's then a huge zot sound effect, and it is followed by a clang of Calibretto hitting the floor. This loud noise awakens Gully from her slumber, and she hops out of bed and looks through a knothole in the door to see that Calibretto is being carried out of the home by a group of fiendish-looking monsters, which are called Grinners. This, of course, because of the fact that they have big mouths with large teeth and no other defining facial features, honestly. It's not exactly explained how they see or perceive the world, but nonetheless, it's a very cool-looking and intimidating type of monster design, and I like this one a lot. After seeing this, Gully is, of course, terribly frightened as she gasps and tries to decide what her next move should be. Gully then turns and grabs the box containing her father's gloves and hides in the closet. We then find out that the band of Grinners is actually being led by the sole werewolf who survived the assault by Calibretto, who is still tracking Gully, trying to find her and the gloves. He states that he was foolish in toying with her the night before, and he won't make that mistake again. Gully tries to silence herself, hiding inside of the closet, very terrified about what's going on, as we see the wolf tell the Grinners that he knows she's here and that they need to spread out and find her. Suddenly, the box containing the gloves begins to glow, and Gully opens it up, pulls the gloves out, and places them on her hands as we see the werewolf getting closer to the closet. Then the glove begins to glow, and suddenly a huge burst of energy comes out of the glove, hits Gully in the chest, raises her up off the ground, and causes her eyes to glow as she is overwhelmed with the pure energy and raw power that is contained within the gloves. We then see that the werewolf discovers Gully inside of the closet as he slashes through the door, sending splinters of wood everywhere as Gully collapses down to the ground, kind of stunned and in awe of the power that's just surged through her body. We see the werewolf look through the hole of the door and notice that Gully is crouching down on the ground, seemingly afraid of him, as he decides that this is his moment of triumph, and he walks in stating, "I hate when my prey doesn't run." He then raises a battle axe above his head and then brings it down full force across Gully's head. However, to his surprise and also Gully's, the axe shatters upon impact. He looks up at the stump of wood that he's now holding, which used to be the handle of the axe, and is confused. Gully then looks up with her father's glove next to her head and states, "I'm not running from you anymore." As we can see, she's rather angry and tired of being the one who's being chased and having to live in fear. We then get an advertisement for the Legends of the Dark Knight toy line. This, of course, is supposed to be a view from inside of Batman's cowl. However, this is not at all what it would look like to be wearing Batman's cowl and looking out from inside of it, as these eye holes would be right up next to your eyes, not, several feet in front of them. And if this is actually what Batman's view looked like, he'd probably be getting his ass kicked on a non-stop basis every time he went out to try and fight crime. We then see that Gully finishes her sentence by screaming the word "ever" as she strikes the werewolf, hitting him so hard that he actually launches through the roof of Nolan's home, up through the air and into the surrounding forest. The Grinners are all shocked at this as they look up, stating, "What in the world did we miss?" However, they're interrupted when a couple of red dots appear on their foreheads, and Calibretto, who is now conscious once again, responds by stating, "Nothing worth dying for," as he transforms one of his arms into some sort of gun weapon, unleashes 2 shots, killing both of the Grinners instantly, and before he can try and regain his bearing and continue to see if there's any more threats, he's interrupted by a scream of a familiar voice. We then get a better ad for the Dark Knight, or Legends of the Dark Knight toy line, where we can see the Man-Bat, Joker, and Penguin. I didn't realize that this was produced by Kenner. However, at this point in time, I'm almost positive that Kenner had been purchased by Hasbro. Yeah, in 1998, they would have been part of Hasbro at that point, who was still using the Kenner imprint, but Kenner was no longer an independent company. So I wonder, I guess this would have been before Hasbro. Yeah, 98, Hasbro would not yet have had the Marvel toy line rights. So this is back when they still would have been producing toys for DC. None of these look incredibly bad. They all seem pretty reasonable for that point in time. I'm not really too big a fan of the way this Joker looks, but this Man-Bat looks pretty neat. I like that one. I'd like to see more of this line. I may end up looking up some of these toys on eBay or something just to see what all they were about and how many toys actually existed in this line. Calibretto immediately races towards the sound of the scream, believing that the worst case scenario is afoot and that Gully is in mortal danger. As he reaches the edge of the forest, he notices that a massive path has already been cleared through the trees and that the trees themselves have been snapped in half at the trunks like twigs. He's shocked at this sight and wonders what exactly could have done it. He then comes across the bodies of the other two Grinners, which are just dead in bloody heaps on the ground, and then finally comes up on Gully, who is mercilessly pummeling the werewolf, screaming at the top of her lungs, "Tell me what you've done with my father, tell me." Realizing that the werewolf is expired, Calibretto reaches out and grabs Gully's fist, stating, "That's enough, he can no longer give you the answers you're looking for." This snaps Gully out of her rage, and she looks at her hands covered in blood and realizes now what she's done, and immediately collapses into Calibretto's chest, screaming, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, I'm so sorry," as we see her crying at the foot of the golem. Now, was Gully justified in doing this? Yeah, probably, given the fact that this werewolf has spent the last 12 hours hunting her to try and murder her, and already smashed a battle axe across the back of her head as he believed that was going to finish the job. And honestly, until it shattered, Gully probably believed that was going to be the case as well. Keep in mind, this werewolf and his cohorts also murdered her nanny. So it stands to reason that she did not use excessive force when defending herself against this clearly mortal threat to her life. We are then teleported to the Mana region, where we see a large extravagant mansion up on a hill over what looks to be a field of mana, but it looks also as if it's a desolate wasteland, as we can even see some sort of mining equipment in the background. The man in charge of this home is Raymond, and he's approached by his manservant as Raymond states, "Oh, something great has happened." His manservant states, "Oh, you've decided to leave me all of your wealth when you die?" Of course, this was just a deadpan joke, and Raymond states, "No, our dwarven friends to the south have located a huge mana deposit, one of the biggest ever." He then states that this is no laughing matter and that his manservant shouldn't make these jokes, as mana is basically the electrical power of this entire universe, and that all of their technology runs on it, and if they can't keep finding more, all of their technology dies as a result. So it's imperative that they keep finding new mana deposits, as their current deposits seem to be starting to get low. His manservant states, "Yes, I understand all that. Here's your dinner, and also someone delivered this package for you. I don't know what it is, but it seems to be a gift." Raymond picks up the card that came with the package, as it reads to put in a little bit of mana to power it and see what it is. He believes that this is actually quite fun and mysterious, as he plugs in what looks to be some sort of little mana battery to the base of this gift, and then begins to unwrap what looks to be a somewhat provocatively dressed doll. He's rather astounded by it and finds it quite beautiful as he strokes the cheek. However, when it comes to life, its eyes glow and it grins to show a mouthful of sharpened teeth. It then bursts open the bottom half of its wrapping, exposing that from the waist down, it's some sort of mechanical spider, which states, "Oh, are you still playing with dolls, Raymond?" Raymond states, "I know that voice, but that's impossible. We killed you," as he smacks the small doll with his clipboard. However, as the doll is flying through the air, it immediately launches a metallic whip from its thorax, which wraps around Raymond's neck and begins to choke him. The doll then mounts itself on top of him and states, "Oh no, you thought I was dead, but I'm not. And I can assure you of one thing, my fleshy friend," as it stands over his face, grinning maniacally. The man in question then states that power is everything, as we see a close-up of his masked face, realizing that this is in fact the same man who hired the werewolves, and also the man from Nolan's dream in the previous issue. We then see that he hovers through the air, surrounded by some sort of magical energy, and he is going after all of the people he believes betrayed him, and that most importantly, he's going to leave Nolan for last, as that's the man who he seems to have the biggest beef with. We then, of course, get a close-up of Nolan's face as he screams, "What the?" Of course, this is in reference to him returning to his now destroyed home. We then get an advertisement for Wildcats number 50, which is listed down on the bottom as "It's just a beginning." And in a way, it kind of was, because as I stated at the beginning of this video, this issue came out in May of 1998, and by the end of the year, Wildstorm would have been sold to Detective Comics. And that from January 99 up until right now when I'm recording this video, all of the Wildstorm characters are owned by DC and subsequently Warner Brothers and no longer part of the Image imprint, which in many ways for me is rather sad, especially given the fact that DC only periodically does anything with the Wildstorm characters, and when they do, it's typically just Wildcats. Once in a while, they'll throw you a bone with some people from the Authority, or even Stormwatch occasionally, and oh my gosh, once in a great while, somebody from Wetworks. But, I mean, when you look at some of the other characters, like the characters from Cybernary, Deathblow a few times has been used. Union, I don't know if he's ever been used. Maybe like one time he's shown up since DC took over all of the Wildstorm characters. And sadly, I really wish these characters could still exist in a place where they might get used instead of being put on the back burner by DC, who's always going to prioritize the classic DC characters over any of the Wildstorm imprint characters. We then get an advertisement for the Resident Evil tie-in comic, issue number 2 specifically. This, of course, was part of Wildstorm Productions, as they apparently had picked up the licensing rights for Resident Evil. I have never in my life read one of these, or even seen one, if I'm being quite honest. But if you have, please feel free to tell me all about it. I'd like to know who the artist was that worked on this, and if they were actually any good. We then get an advertisement for the world's greatest comic book fonts. These were catalogs that just showed hundreds and hundreds of fonts that you could use in comic books. Now, the first time I saw this advertisement, I actually kind of mocked it, thinking that it was rather silly. But a friend of mine pointed out to me that prior to comics being produced almost 100% digitally, these were an absolute must-have for letterers, as this was the way you knew what all of the current different fonts were. And if an artist said, hey, use this font on this page, or an editor said, you know, I'd prefer that these letters were in this font, this was your reference guide to all of it. And you had to hand draw everything based on these reference guides. So they were actually a really important tool for the time that just seemed kind of archaic when you look back at them now in the future world of 2025 and, you know, see that these don't make sense in our world now, given that all of these fonts are just existing on a digital platform. Nolan then screams, "What happened to my house?" And Calabretto tries to explain, stating that the gloves. However, he's then interrupted when Nolan states, "The gloves? The gloves?" Getting even more angry as he specifically told Calabretto not to let Gully use the gloves. Calabretto understands that Nolan is now becoming extremely enraged and even says, "You need to calm down. Your temper is actually affecting the environment." Nolan then states, "Yeah, well, it's going to be affecting something else if you don't explain real quick." At this point, Calabretto begins to incredibly quickly explain the entirety of what happened during the day, to the point where it begins to overwhelm Nolan as he's simply stating, okay, and then finally just clanks Calabretto in the forehead with his staff to try and get him to stop. He then states, "Where is the girl?" He tells him that Gully is inside in what's left of the sunroom, and Nolan goes in to see her. Of course, at this point, Gully is just kind of sulking and very emotional, very scared, and states, "I suppose you're going to ask me to leave now," as she looks upon him with sad eyes. However, Nolan simply lights his pipe and states, "No, you're free to stay here as long as you'd like. Now get some rest because you're going to need it tomorrow when you have to clean up the mess you've made," as he closes the door to the room she's in. On the next page, we get gun, blade, butt, boobs, skin-tight sexy outfit, Joe Madureira telling Subtlety to go straight to hell. As we're seeing right now, yep, this was the page designed specifically to appeal to the 13-year-old boy demographic. On the next page, we get an advertisement for C23. Now, for those of you who don't know, C23 was actually a collectible card game as well as a comic book. And the comic book's purpose was to help sell the collectible card game. However, that didn't work, and the collectible card game was an absolute failure. And as a result, they then canceled the comic book because its reason for existing was no longer there. Which, honestly, I find to be rather unfortunate because I do own all 6 issues of the comic book. And in my opinion, it was pretty cool and like a really intriguing story. Now, I never played the card game, and apparently no one else really did either. But I really wish they had just kept the story going with the comic book because, despite the fact that the card game was gone, the comic book was still an interesting read and could have stood alone on its own merit. However, that was a decision that Jim Lee had to make for himself, and he decided apparently to just basically shelve the comic book and move on with the future and just kind of cut his losses. Now, if any of you have ever actually played this card game, let me know what it was about and how it played in the comment section down below, because I have yet to ever meet a single person who's ever owned any of the C23 cards, let alone played the game itself. On the next page, we get an advertisement for Stormwatch. Now, as I'm recording this, I have not made it to this point in the Stormwatch series where Warren Ellis is the writer for the series. However, if you'd like to know more about the early issues of Stormwatch, if you're watching this as I'm uploading it, you can check out my Stormwatch playlist. I have the first 5 issues of Stormwatch, well, 6 if you count issue 0 as well, on that playlist, and I'll be continuing it until I run out of Stormwatch issues. Back to the story, we can see that there is an airplane flying through the sky. This plane looks like something equivalent to maybe like the mid to late 1930s. Which is our first real glimpse of the idea that despite this being a very fantasy-oriented world, that it does have some glimpses of a more modern technology. Now, obviously, this plane is powered by mana, as it was established on an earlier page, that mana is the power source for all of the technology in this world. But it is unique to see this blending of fantasy and analog tech all in the same world. We then see Monica walking across the deck of the plane, surrounded by a bunch of collapsed, seemingly dead bodies. We then see this panel of her where her breasts have apparently gotten even bigger, and she states, "Is everything ready?" The 2 men who accompanied her in the previous issue state that yes, everything is ready to go, and then Monica states, "Well, then I suggest you hold on to something." We then see the plane making its approach to what is presumably Skyhold, as Monica states this is where things are about to get ugly. Of course, this is in fact the mission that she tried to recruit Garrison for in issue number 1, and it seems as though that things may get into a sticky situation for her and the 2 men that work for her. We then move on to the Battle Chasers letter section, where some people made some unfortunate predictions and hopes that didn't exactly pan out. One letter was from Pat McCullen, who at the time was the editor-in-chief at Wizard Magazine. He states that before reading Battle Chasers number 1, he believed that the series was kind of doomed at launch, but after reading it, he believed that there was something there and that it was going to be a long-lasting series. Unfortunately, he was right with his first observation, and that Battle Chasers was in fact kind of doomed at launch, as it took 25 years for them to produce 12 issues of the series. Which brings me to my next point, a reader who states that he had hoped that Battle Chasers would reach issue 200. He was severely disappointed. And the team who was replying to these letters, it may have been Dunbier who was replying to these letters, stated that they had actually plotted out 20 issues as of the writing and publishing of this issue, which again, maybe you had 20 issues plotted out, but from this point on, you only produced 10 of them. There was one reader who was actually pleasantly surprised that Battle Chasers existed when he went to the comic book store, because he was not really a comic book reader, but one of his friends wanted to give some a try, or wanted him to give them a try. Now, when they went to the comic book store, he asked his friend, well, what do they have in terms of like sci-fi fantasy stuff? And his friend was like, well, nothing basically. And maybe in 1998 that was the case. And he was really disheartened by that, as he had always been a reader of fantasy novels, and he was really sad that these novels had not been translated into the comic book world. And when he came across Battle Chasers, he was just overjoyed at the idea that there was like a high fantasy type of comic book that existed that he could buy. Unfortunately for him, it wouldn't be around for very long, but for the few months that he had the opportunity to buy this book, it was probably really nice for him. And on the reverse inside cover, we get an advertisement for Gen 13 Bootleg number 19. Now, as of recording this video, I have not recorded any episodes on Gen 13 Bootleg, and if I'm being quite honest, I don't know how many issues of Gen 13 Bootleg I actually have. However, if you would like to know more about the early beginnings of the initial Gen 13 ongoing series, you can check it out in my Gen 13 playlist. And that was Battle Chasers number 2. And I gotta say, I really thought this was a very good issue. It does a fantastic job of continuing to build on the story that was established in issue number 1. We get a deeper look into the backstory of Garrison and why his life is in shambles. We get a little bit more on the villain of the story. We still don't know who he is or exactly what his motivations are, but we know now that he is definitely targeting Nolan. And we know from Nolan's dream that he may have a pretty good reason as to why he was doing that. We also get more of an explanation to Calibretto's abilities, and see now that he is not completely invincible, and that with the right weaponry, he can be taken down. Now, we also get the in-your-face check out Monica's boobs page. However, that doesn't overshadow the rest of the story, in my opinion, considering it is literally just one page of the novel. And, maybe you're the kind of person that likes that. Maybe you're the kind of person who doesn't. But I also understand why Joe was doing that, given that, he was trying to also bring in a demographic of 13-year-old boys, as well as other comic book readers. But it does seem a little bit shameless and objectifying, but that's because it kind of was. But like I said, I don't feel like that really distracts from the overall story and quality of this book, as to me, the rest of the book is so good that you can kind of overlook that. But then again, these are just my opinions. You may think that the story of this book was terrible. You may be really happy that you've got half-naked Monica in the pages of this book with big in-your-face breasts just staring you down. And if that's the case, it's okay, because everyone's entitled to their own opinions. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.